Elena Vasquez was only 6 years old when she first heard a piano being played, and that moment changed everything about her life forever. She was walking home from school with her mother through the busy streets of Queens, New York, when they passed by a small music shop on the corner of their block, and through the open door came the most beautiful sound Elena had ever heard in her young life. Her feet stopped moving before her brain even understood what was happening, and she stood there on the dirty sidewalk, with her mouth hanging open like she had just seen magic happen right in front of her eyes. Her mother tugged at her hand and told her they needed to hurry home because dinner would not cook itself. But Elena could not move from that spot inside the shop. An old man with gray hair and wrinkled hands was playing a black piano that looked bigger than anything Elena had ever seen, and his fingers were dancing across the white and black keys like butterflies landing on flowers. The music floating out of that shop wrapped around Elena like a warm blanket on a cold night, and she felt tears forming in her eyes even though she did not understand why she wanted to cry. Her mother finally picked her up and carried her away, but Elena looked back at that music shop until it disappeared from her view, and she knew in her heart that she had found something that would stay with her forever that night. Elena could not sleep because the music kept playing inside her head over and over again like a song that refused to leave. She lay in her small bed in the tiny room she shared with her 2 younger brothers, and she moved her fingers in the air above her face, pretending she was playing those beautiful notes she had heard earlier that day. From that moment on, Elena became obsessed with pianos and piano music in a way that worried her parents because they were poor people who could barely afford to put food on the table. Her father drove a taxi in the city from early morning until 2 o'clock in the morning, and he came home every night with tired eyes and aching bones. Her mother cleaned houses for rich families in Manhattan, scrubbing their toilets and washing their floors, while her own apartment had cracks in the walls and mice in the kitchen. They lived in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, and the constant rumbling of the washing machines below made the floor vibrate day and night. There was no money for music lessons, and there was certainly no money for a piano, which Elena learned cost more than her father made in several months of driving his taxi through the dangerous streets. But Elena was not a girl who gave up eyes, and she found ways to feed her love for music even when the world told her she could not have what she wanted. She started going to the public library after school every day, and she would sit in the corner with headphones on, listening to recordings of the greatest piano players in history. She learned names like Chopin and Beethoven and Mozart, and she listened to their music until she knew every note by heart. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, noticed this small girl who came every day to listen to classical music, and she started saving special recordings just for Elena. When Elena was 8 years old, she did something that showed just how much fire burned inside her small body. She took a large piece of cardboard from behind the laundromat downstairs, and she brought it up to her apartment and spread it out on the floor of her bedroom. Then she took a black marker and carefully drew a piano keyboard on that cardboard, measuring each key with a ruler she borrowed from school to make sure they were the exact right size. She counted 88 keys, just like a real piano, and she colored the black keys carefully with her marker until her fingers were stained with ink. Her mother found her that night sitting on the floor in front of her cardboard keyboard, her eyes closed, her fingers pressing the drawn keys while she hummed a Chopin nocturne she had memorized from the library recordings. Instead of laughing at her daughter or telling her to stop being silly, Maria Vasquez sat down on the floor next to Elena and watched her play. Her silent music tears rolled down the mother's face because she understood that her daughter had a gift that deserved more than a cardboard keyboard in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. She went to her husband that night, after the children were asleep, and told him they needed to find a way to help Elena, even if it seemed impossible. Roberto Vasquez was a practical man who had learned long ago that dreams were luxuries poor people could not afford. He'd come to America from Mexico with dreams of his own, dreams of becoming a business owner, dreams of giving his family a good life. But those dreams had faded into the reality of 16-hour workdays and bills that never stopped coming. But when his wife told him about their daughter and her cardboard piano, something stirred in his tired heart. He started driving extra shifts, sleeping only 4 hours a night, saving every penny he could hide from the monthly expenses. Maria took on additional houses to clean, waking up at 4 in the morning and not returning home until after dark. They did this for an entire year, and they never told Elena what they were doing or why they looked more exhausted than ever before. On Elena's 9th birthday, her parents woke her up early and told her they had a surprise for her. They walked her down the street to a small church 3 blocks from their apartment, and the priest, Father Domingo, was waiting for them at the door. With a smile on his face, he led them inside the empty church to a corner near the back, where an old upright piano sat against the wall, dusty and slightly out of tune but real and solid and beautiful. Father Domingo explained that the piano had been donated to the church years ago but nobody ever played it, and he had agreed to let Elena come and practice on it whenever she wanted as long as she was respectful and quiet. Elena walked up to that piano like she was approaching something holy, and her hands were shaking when she reached out to touch the keys. For the first time she pressed one key, just one single key, and the note that rang out in that empty church was the most beautiful sound she had ever created in her life. She sat down on the bench and placed all 10 fingers on the keys. And even though she had never had a single lesson, she started to play. The music that came out was clumsy and imperfect, but it was music. Real music made by her own hands on a real piano. And Alina laughed and cried at the same time while her parents held each other and watched their daughter's dream come true. From that day forward, Alina spent every free moment at that church piano, teaching herself to play from books she borrowed from the library and recordings she memorized note by note. Father Domingo would often sit in the back of the church and listen to her practice, and he told everyone who would listen that there was a special child in his church who played piano like an angel sent from heaven. Neighbors started to talk about the Vasquez girl who walked to church every day not to pray but to play, and some of them thought she was strange while others thought she was wonderful. Alina did not care what anyone thought, because when she sat at that piano, the whole world disappeared and she became someone else entirely, someone powerful and free and full of light. She was no longer the poor girl from the apartment above the laundromat, and she was no longer the daughter of a taxi driver and a house cleaner. She was a musician, and nothing and nobody would ever be able to take that away from her. What Alina did not know was that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined, and the cardboard keyboard that still sat in her bedroom would soon become a memory of where she had started on a journey that would take her further than any Vasquez had ever gone before. 3 years had passed since Alina first touched the keys of that old church piano, and in that time she had transformed from a curious child into something extraordinary that nobody in her neighborhood had ever seen before. She was now 12 years old, and she could play pieces that professional musicians struggled with, all without ever having a single formal lesson from a trained teacher. Father Domingo had spread the word about his young pianist to everyone he knew, and one Sunday afternoon, a woman walked into the church while Alina was practicing and stood in the shadows listening for nearly an hour without making a sound. This woman was Margaret Wells, a retired music professor who had taught at some of the finest conservatories in the country before her health forced her to slow down and move to a quieter life. She had heard rumors about a prodigy playing in a small church in Queens, and she had come to see for herself if the stories were true. What she witnessed that afternoon left her speechless and shaking, because the girl at the piano was playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 with a depth of emotion and technical skill that should have been impossible for someone her age and background. When Alina finished playing and turned around, she was startled to see a stranger standing in the church with tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Margaret Wells walked up to Alina and took her small hands in her own, examining the fingers that had just created such beautiful music. She asked Alina where she had studied and who her teachers were, and when Alina explained that she had taught herself using library books and recordings, Margaret Wells actually laughed out loud in disbelief, but she believed it, because she had just witnessed it with her own eyes and ears. And she knew that she was standing in front of something rare and precious that the world needed to know about. Margaret Wells made it her personal mission to help Alina reach her full potential, and she started by making phone calls to people she had known during her long career in music education. One of those calls went to the admissions office of the Whitmore Conservatory, the most prestigious music school for young people in the entire northeastern United States, which was a place where the children of wealthy families sent their sons and daughters to become the next generation of classical musicians, and its graduates had gone on to play in the finest orchestras and concert halls around the world. The tuition at Whitmore was more money than Roberto Vasquez made in an entire year of driving his taxi, and the idea of Alina attending such a place seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. But Margaret Wells was a determined woman with powerful connections, and she arranged for Alina to audition for a scholarship that could cover most of her expenses. The audition was held on a cold February morning, and Alina rode the subway with her mother for over an hour to reach the beautiful building in Manhattan, where Whitmore held its classes. Alina had never seen a building so grand and impressive, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers and portraits of famous musicians hanging on the walls. The other children waiting to audition were dressed in expensive clothes and carried instruments that cost more than everything the Vasquez family owned combined. Was wearing her best dress, which her mother had bought at a thrift store and altered 3 times to make it fit properly, and she felt like she did not belong in this place at all. But when she sat down at the grand piano in the audition room, all of her fear and doubt melted away like snow in the summer sun. She played 3 pieces that day, including the same Chopin ballade that had moved Margaret Wells to tears, and when she finished, the panel of judges sat in stunned silence for nearly a minute. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Vasquez apartment that would change the course of Alina's life forever. She had been accepted to the Whitmore Conservatory on a partial scholarship that would cover 70% of her tuition, with the rest to be paid through work-study programs and financial aid. Her parents cried and hugged her, and called every relative they knew to share the news, and Father Domingo held a special celebration at the church where Alina played for all the neighbors who had watched her grow up. But the happiness of that moment could not prepare Alina for the harsh reality of what awaited her at Whitmore, where being talented was not enough to earn respect and acceptance. From her very first day at the conservatory, Alina felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her from every direction. The other students looked at her worn clothes and heard her accent and knew immediately that she was not one of them. and many of them made sure she never forgot it. They whispered about her in the hallways and excluded her from their study groups and social gatherings, and some of them openly mocked her background when they thought the teachers could not hear. But the cruelest treatment came not from the other students but from her own assigned teacher, a woman named Madame Genevieve Forsyth, who had been a famous concert pianist in her younger years. Madame Forsyth was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to look down at everyone she encountered, even people who were taller than her. She had taught at Whitmore for 25 years and had produced some of the finest young pianists in the country, and she had very specific ideas about which students were worth her time and attention. When she first met Alina, she looked at the girl's small hands and humble clothing and made a decision that would haunt Alina for years to come. She decided that Alina was a charity case, a project that the school had taken on to look good in the newspapers, not a serious musician worthy of serious instruction. In their first private lesson together, Madame Forsyth assigned Alina a simple piece by Debussy, a gentle and soft composition that any intermediate student could master in a week or two. Alina was confused because she had played far more difficult pieces at her audition, and she asked if perhaps there had been a mistake with the assignment. Madame Forsyth looked at her with cold eyes and said words that Alina would never forget for as long as she lived. "You have small hands and a small background," she said in her French accented English. "Play small, and perhaps you will find a small place in this world." Alina felt those words cut into her heart like knives, but she did not cry in front of her teacher, because she had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford. She took the sheet music for the simple Debussy piece and walked out of the lesson room with her head held high, even though inside she was falling apart. In the weeks and months that followed, Madame Forsyth continued to assign Alina only the quietest and simplest pieces in the piano repertoire. Other students her age were learning Rachmaninoff and Liszt and other composers who wrote music full of fire and passion. Alina was stuck playing gentle nocturnes and soft preludes that required no power or emotion. She tried multiple times to talk to Madame Forsyth about being given more challenging work, but each time she was shut down with the same cold dismissal. "Know your place," Madame Forsyth would say, "and you will go far enough." Alina began to wonder if her teacher was right, if maybe she had been fooling herself all along about her talent and potential. Maybe she really was just a poor girl from Queens who had gotten lucky with a scholarship, and maybe she would never be anything more than that. But deep inside her chest, beneath all the doubt and pain, a small flame continued to burn, a flame that refused to be extinguished. No matter how hard the world tried to put it out, she would practice the simple pieces Madame Forsyth assigned her during the day, performing them perfectly in her lessons and receiving grudging approval from her teacher. But at night, when she went home to the apartment above the laundromat, she would take out the music she really wanted to play and practice on her cardboard keyboard. She would close her eyes and move her fingers across those drawn keys, and in her mind she was playing the thunderous concertos and passionate sonatas that Madame Forsyth said she would never be ready for. Her mother would sometimes stand in the doorway and watch her daughter playing her silent music, and she would feel her heart break a little more each time. Maria Vasquez did not understand why such a talented girl was being held back by people who were supposed to be helping her grow, and she wished there was something she could do to make things right. But she was just a house cleaner with no power or influence in the world of classical music, and all she could do was love her daughter and believe in her when nobody else seemed to. Alina kept her head down and did what she was told at Whitmore, but inside her mind she was making plans that nobody knew about. She was waiting for the right moment to show the world who she really was, and she was preparing herself for a battle that she knew would come sooner or later. The flame inside her chest grew stronger every day, fed by the doubt and dismissal of everyone who underestimated her. And Alina knew that one day that flame would become a fire that nobody could ignore. She just had to survive long enough to let it burn. Alina had been at Whitmore for almost 2 years when I discovered something that would become the important secret of her young life. It happened on a Thursday evening in late October when she had stayed after school to work on a paper for her music theory class. The building was supposed to be empty by 7 o'clock, and all the students and teachers had gone home hours ago. Alina was walking down the long hallway toward the exit when she heard something that made her stop in her tracks and hold her breath. What's coming from somewhere deep inside the building. Piano music so beautiful and sad that it made Alina's eyes fill with tears just from hearing it. She followed the sound through the dark hallways until she reached a small practice room in the basement of the building, a room she had never even known existed. Through the small window in the door, she could see a man sitting at an old upright piano, his dark hands moving slowly across the keys as he played a melody that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. The man was the night's janitor, a tall African man with gray hair and kind eyes who Alina had seen pushing his mop and bucket through the hallways after classes ended. She had never spoken to him before, and she had certainly never imagined that he could play piano like this. Alina stood at that window for a long time, afraid to move or make any sound that might break the spell of the music she was hearing. But eventually the man stopped playing and turned around, and he saw Alina's face in the window and smiled at her like he had been expecting her all along. His name was Emmanuel O'Connor, and he had come to America from Nigeria more than 30 years ago with dreams of becoming a concert pianist. He had studied at one of the finest music schools in Lagos and had won competitions all across West Africa before he saved enough money to buy a plane ticket to New York. Those early days in America, Emmanuel had played in small jazz clubs and restaurants, and he had even auditioned for several symphony orchestras that were looking for talented pianists. But then something terrible happened that changed everything about his life and his future. He developed arthritis in his hands, a painful condition that made his fingers stiff and clumsy, and unable to perform the complex movements that concert piano required. One by one, the opportunities dried up and the doors closed, and Emmanuel found himself working as a janitor just to pay his rent and put food on his table. He had been cleaning the floors at Whitmore for 15 years now, and every night after everyone went home, he would come down to this forgotten practice room and play the music that still lived inside his heart. His hands could no longer perform the difficult pieces he had once played with ease, but he could still make the piano sing with simple melodies and gentle songs that reminded him of who he used to be when Alina told him her story. Emmanuel Okonkwo recognized something in this small girl that he had not seen in a very long time. He saw the same fire that had once burned inside his own chest, the same hunger for music that would not be satisfied with small dreams and simple pieces. He asked Alina to play something for him, and she sat down at the old piano and performed one of the gentle Debussy pieces that Madame Forsyth had assigned her. Emmanuel listened politely until she finished, and then he shook his head and asked her to play what she really wanted to play. Alina looked at him with surprise, because nobody had ever asked her that question before, and she did not know how to answer at first. But then she closed her eyes and let her fingers find the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece she had memorized from recordings but had never played on a real piano. She could not play the whole thing because it required an orchestra to accompany the piano, but she played the famous solo passages with a passion and power that made Emmanuel Okonkwo's eyes go wide with amazement when she finished. He sat in silence for a long moment, and then he said something that changed Elena's life forever. He told her that she had a gift that could not be taught and could not be bought, a gift that came from somewhere deep inside her soul that had nothing to do with money or background or the size of her hands. He told her that Madame Forsyth was wrong about her, and that anyone who tried to make her play small was afraid of how bright she could shine. And then he made her a promise that he kept every single day for the next 2 years. He told her that she could come to this practice room any night she wanted, and he would let her in and stand guard while she played the music she was meant to play from that night forward. Elena lived 2 separate lives that nobody knew about except Emmanuel. During the day, she was the quiet scholarship student who played gentle pieces and kept her head down and did not make trouble. She attended her lessons with Madame Forsyth and played the simple music she was assigned, never complaining, never asking for more. But at night, after her parents thought she was asleep, she would sneak out of the apartment and take the subway to Whitmore, where Emmanuel would be waiting for her at the side door with the keys to the basement practice room. In that room, with its old piano and flickering lights and water-stained ceiling, Alina taught herself to play the music that set her soul on fire. She learned Liszt's Hungarian rhapsodies with their wild rhythms and impossible runs, and she practiced until her fingers could fly across the keys like birds in a hurricane. She studied Prokofiev's sonatas with their sharp edges and modern harmonies, music that sounded like the chaos and beauty of the 20th century all mixed together. She mastered Chopin's most difficult etudes, the ones that most pianists were afraid to attempt, and she played them with a precision and emotion that would have shocked her teachers if they had ever heard her. Emmanuel could not play these pieces anymore with his stiff and painful hands, but he could listen and guide and teach in ways that went beyond physical technique. He told Alina stories about the great pianists he had heard in his youth, legends like Vladimir Horowitz and Arthur Rubinstein. And Martha Argerich explained how music was not just about hitting the right notes but about telling a story, about making the listener feel something deep in their heart that words could never express. He taught her about phrasing and dynamics, about when to hold back and when to let loose, about the silence between notes that was just as important as the notes themselves. Lena absorbed everything he told her like a sponge soaking up water in a desert, and she practiced until her fingers bled and her arms ached and she could barely keep her eyes open. Her grades at school began to suffer because she was always tired from her secret nighttime practice sessions, and Madame Forsyth commented more than once that Alina seemed distracted and unfocused. But Alina did not care about grades or what Madame Forsyth thought of her because she knew something that nobody else knew. She knew that she was becoming the pianist she was always meant to be, and that one day soon she would have a chance to show the world what she could really do. Emmanuel warned her to be patient and to wait for the right moment to reveal her true abilities. He told her that timing was everything in music and in life, and that a great performance delivered at the wrong time could be wasted like water poured into sand. So Alina continued to live her double life, playing small during the day and playing big at night, waiting for the opportunity that she knew would come eventually. The other students at Whitmore had no idea that the quiet girl they looked down on was secretly becoming one of the most skilled pianists any of them had ever encountered. They continued to exclude her from their groups and whisper about her behind her back, and Alina let them believe that she was nothing special. Madame Forsyth continued to assign her simple pieces and make dismissive comments about her potential, and Elena accepted every assignment with a polite nod and a quiet yes. Madame Button sighed. Elena was counting the days until she could prove them all wrong, until she could stand on a stage and play the music that burned inside her like a wildfire. She talked to Emmanuel about her dreams, about playing in the great concert halls of the world, about showing everyone who had ever doubted her that they had made a terrible mistake. Emmanuel would listen to her with a sad smile on his face, because he knew better than anyone how the world could crush dreams and steal futures from people who deserved so much more. But he also believed in Elena in a way that he had stopped believing in himself many years ago. And he told her that she would succeed where he had failed. He told her that his arthritis had taken away his ability to play, but it had not taken away his knowledge or his love for music. And now all of that knowledge and love was being passed to her. Elena cried when he said this because she understood what it meant for Emmanuel to give her this gift, to pour everything he had left into helping her become what he could never be. She promised him that she would not waste it, that she would work harder than anyone had ever worked before, and that she would carry his dream with her wherever her music took her. The hidden hours in that basement practice room became the most precious time of Elena's life, and she guarded the secret of those nights like a treasure more valuable than gold. She was building something in the darkness that would one day burst into the light, and when that day came, nobody would ever be able to ignore her again. The fire inside her was growing stronger every day, and soon it would be ready to burn. The Whitmore Winter Showcase was the most important event on the conservatory's calendar, and every student dreamed of being chosen to perform on that famous stage for more than 50 years. The showcase had been the place where young musical careers were launched and futures were decided in the span of a single evening. Scouts from the most prestigious music schools in the country would fill the auditorium, along with critics from major newspapers and wealthy donors who supported the arts. A great performance at the Winter Showcase could open doors that would otherwise remain closed forever, and a poor performance could close doors that might never open again. Elena had watched the showcase from the audience for the past 2 years, sitting in the back rows with the other scholarship students while the children of wealthy families took their turns on stage. She had seen students her age play concertos and sonatas that made the audience gasp with amazement, and she had dreamed of being up there herself, showing the world what she could really do. This year, Elena was finally old enough to be considered for the showcase, and she had allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Madame Forsyth would give her a chance to prove herself. The announcement of the showcased repertoire was posted on the main bulletin board on a Monday morning in early December, and students crowded around it like hungry animals fighting for food. Elena waited until most of the crowd had cleared before she approached the board, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She scanned the list of names and pieces, looking for her own name among the 20 students who had been selected to perform. Her finger stopped when she found it near the bottom of the list, and she read the words next to her name 3 times before she could believe what she was seeing. Elena Vasquez, Eric Satie, Gymnopedy number E. She stood there staring at those words as the hallway emptied around her, and the noise of the other students faded into silence. At Gymnopedy number 1 was one of the simplest pieces in the entire piano repertoire, a gentle and dreamy composition that lasted only about 3 minutes. It was beautiful in its own quiet way, but it was the kind of piece that beginners played at their first recitals, not the kind of piece that serious students performed at the most important showcase of the year. Elena looked at the other names on the list and saw what they had been assigned. Jonathan Whitmore III, the grandson of the school's founder, would be playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. Sophia Chen, whose parents had donated a new wing to the building last year, would be performing Liszt's La Campana, a showpiece that required fingers of lightning and nerves of steel. Even students who Elena knew were less skilled than her had been given challenging and impressive pieces that would showcase their abilities, but Elena, who could play any of these pieces and more, had been given 3 minutes of whispered notes that would make no impression on anyone in the audience. She felt her eyes filling with tears, but she refused to let them fall where anyone might see her weakness. She walked away from the bulletin board with her back straight and her head high, just as she had learned to do every time the world knocked her down. But inside, her heart was breaking into pieces that she did not know how to put back together. That night, she told Emmanuel about the assignment, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw anger flash across his gentle face. He called Madame Forsyth names in his native Yoruba language that Elena did not understand but knew were not compliments. He paced back and forth in the small practice room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he spoke about the unfairness of the world and the cruelty of people who held power over others. But when his anger had burned itself out, he sat down next to Elena and spoke to her in a calm and serious voice that she had never heard from him before. He told her that this was the moment they had been preparing for without even knowing it, the chance they had been waiting for all these months of secret practice. He asked her if she was ready to take the biggest risk of her young life, and Elena looked into his eyes and said yes. Without hesitation, they talked for hours that night about what Elena could do to turn this disappointment into an opportunity. Emmanuel told her stories about musicians throughout history who had shocked the world by defying expectations and breaking rules. He talked about jazz legends who had walked onto stages and played completely different songs than what they had been told to play. He told her about classical musicians who had been banned from concert halls for daring to challenge the establishment. Then he asked her one simple question that changed everything. What if she did not play the piece she had been assigned? What if instead she played something so stunning and so unexpected that nobody in that auditorium would ever forget her name? Elena felt fear and excitement battling inside her chest as she considered what Emmanuel was suggesting. If she defied Madame Forsyth and played a different piece at the showcase, there would be consequences that could destroy her career before it even began. She could be expelled from Whitmore and lose her scholarship forever. She could be blacklisted from other conservatories and universities that would hear about her rebellion. Could break her parents' hearts. After all, they had sacrificed to give her this chance. But if she did nothing, if she walked onto that stage and played her 3 minutes of gentle music, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. She would watch other students get the opportunity she deserved while she faded into the background. Like a ghost that nobody could see, she would become exactly what Madame Forsyth had always told her she would be: small and forgettable, and not worth anyone's time. Elena made her decision that night in the basement practice room. And once she made it, she did not look back. She told Emmanuel that she would play the piece he had been teaching her in secret for the past 6 months. A piece so difficult and so impressive that it would leave the audience speechless. The piece was called Islami by a Russian composer named Mily Balakhov, and it was considered by many experts to be the most technically demanding piano work ever composed. It was a musical tornado that lasted 12 minutes, full of crashing chords and lightning-fast runs and passages that seemed physically impossible for human hands to play. Professional pianists with decades of experience had attempted Islami and failed, and many had vowed never to try it again after being humiliated by its impossible demands. No student at Whitmore had ever performed Islami at the showcase in the school's entire history, and most teachers would have said it was madness for a 14-year-old to even attempt it. But Elena had been working on this piece in secret for 6 months, breaking it down passage by passage, measure by measure, note by note. She had practiced until her fingers could move faster than thought, until the music flowed through her hands like water through a riverbed. Emmanuel believed she was ready, and Elena trusted his judgment more than she trusted anyone else in the world. In the days that followed, Elena pretended that nothing had changed and that she was preparing the Satie piece as she had been told. She attended her lessons with Madame Forsyth and played gymnopédie, no one with perfect technique and appropriate gentleness. Madame Forsyth nodded with approval and told Elena that this piece suited her much better than the ambitious work she had sometimes asked to play. Elena smiled and thanked her teacher and said nothing about what was really going on inside her head at home. She told her parents about the showcase and about the piece she had been assigned, and she saw the disappointment they tried to hide behind their encouraging words. Her mother hugged her and told her that every piece of music was beautiful when played with love, and her father said that he would be proud of her no matter what she played. They did not know that Elena was planning something that would either make them the proudest parents in the world or break their hearts completely. Lena could not tell them what she was going to do because she knew they would try to stop her out of fear for her future. She carried her secret alone, sharing it only with Emmanuel during their nightly practice sessions in the basement room. 2 weeks before the showcase, Elena overheard some of the other students talking about her in the hallway. They were laughing about the simple piece she had been assigned and making jokes about how the scholarship girl was finally being put in her place. One of them said that Elena should be grateful she was allowed to perform at all, considering where she came from. Another said that Madame Forsyth had obviously realized that Elena did not have the talent to play anything more challenging. Elena stood around the corner and listened to every cruel word, and instead of feeling hurt, she felt her determination grow stronger. These students had never struggled for anything in their lives, and they had no idea what it meant to fight for every opportunity. They did not know about the cardboard keyboard or the church piano or the basement practice room where Elena had forged herself into something they could not imagine. They did not know that in 2 weeks, everything they thought they knew about Elena Vasquez would be proven wrong. Let them laugh, Elena thought as she walked away. Let them underestimate me just like everyone else has done my whole life. When the night of the showcase arrived, they would finally see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. They would see the fire that burned inside the quiet girl from Queens. The final rehearsal for the winter showcase was held 1 week before the actual performance, and all 20 students were required to play through their pieces for Madame Forsyth and the other teachers. Elena arrived at the rehearsal hall with her heart beating so fast she thought everyone must be able to hear it. She had not slept more than 4 hours in the past 3 nights because she had been practicing Islami until her fingers knew every note without her brain needing to think about it. But today she would not play Islami, and the difficulty of pretending to be someone she was not had become almost unbearable. When her turn came, Elena walked to the grand piano and sat down on the bench as she had done so many times before. She placed her hands on the keys and played gymnopédie, no one with perfect gentleness, letting the soft notes float through the hall like feathers falling in still air. Madame Forsyth nodded with satisfaction when Elena finished, and she made a small note on her clipboard before calling the next student to perform. Elena returned to her seat among the other students and folded her hands in her lap, keeping her face as blank and calm as a mask, but inside she was screaming with frustration and impatience. counting the days and hours until she could finally show the world who she really was. After the rehearsal, Alina stayed behind to speak with Madame Forsyth, hoping that maybe there was still a way to change her teacher's mind about the assignment. She waited until all the other students had left, and then approached the tall woman with the silver hair and cold eyes. Madame Forsyth looked up from her clipboard and raised one eyebrow as if surprised that Alina would dare to bother her. Alina took a deep breath and asked as politely as she could if there was any possibility of changing her piece for the showcase. He explained that she had been working very hard and that she felt ready to perform something more challenging that would better demonstrate her abilities. Madame Forsyth listened without expression until Alina finished speaking, and then she set down her clipboard and looked at Alina with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. She told Alina that the piece assignments were final and could not be changed under any circumstances. She said that Alina should be grateful for the opportunity to perform at the showcase at all, considering her background and limitations, and then she said something that burned itself into Alina's memory like a brand pressed into flesh. Alina, you must understand that not everyone is meant for greatness, Madame Forsyth said in her smooth and cutting voice. Some people are meant to play in the background, to support the stars rather than be the stars themselves, and there is no shame in accepting your place in the world. Alina felt her hands trembling at her sides, and she had to clench her fists to keep herself from showing any reaction. She wanted to scream at Madame Forsyth that she was wrong, that she had been wrong from the very first day, that Alina could play circles around most of the students at this school, but she said nothing, because she knew that words would not change anything. Only action would matter, only proof that could not be denied or dismissed or explained away. She thanked Madame Forsyth for her time and walked out of the rehearsal hall with her back straight and her eyes dry. Outside the building, she found a quiet corner behind a row of bushes and finally let the tears fall that she had been holding back. She cried for herself, and for her parents, and for Emmanuel, and for every person who had ever been told they were not good enough by someone who did not know anything about them. She cried until she had no more tears left, and then she wiped her face and took a deep breath and felt something change inside her heart. The doubt and fear that had been plaguing her for the past week burned away in the heat of her anger, and what remained was pure determination. She walked to the subway station and rode the train home in silence, watching the faces of the other passengers and wondering how many of them had been told to know their place. When she got home, her mother was waiting with dinner on the table and questions about how the rehearsal had gone. Alina smiled and said everything had gone well, and she ate her rice and beans without tasting anything. Later that night, after her parents and brothers were asleep, she crept out of the apartment and made her way back to Whitmore. Manuel was waiting for her at the side door as he always was, and he could tell immediately from the look on her face that something had happened. They went down to the basement practice room, and Alina told him about her conversation with Madame Forsyth. Emmanuel listened without interrupting, and when Alina finished, he walked to the piano and played a few soft notes while he gathered his thoughts. Then he turned to Alina and spoke to her with more intensity than she had ever heard from him before. He told her that there were two types of people in the world: those who accepted the limits others placed on them and those who refused to be limited by anything. He said that the first type of people lived safe and quiet lives and never knew what they might have become if they had been brave enough to try, but the second type of people changed the world, not by asking permission but by proving that they belonged in places where nobody expected to find them. He asked Alina which type of person she wanted to be, and she answered without hesitation that she wanted to be the second kind. Emmanuel smiled and said that she had already made her choice long ago, back when she drew a piano on cardboard because she could not afford a real one. He told her that every note she had learned and every how she had practiced had been leading to this moment, and then he said something that gave Alina the courage she needed to do what she was about to do. He told her that he believed in her more than he had ever believed in anyone, including himself, and that he would be proud of her no matter what happened. On the night of the showcase, Alina hugged him and felt tears threatening to return, but she pushed them away because she had cried enough for one day. Instead, she sat down at the old piano and began to practice Islami one more time, letting the music carry away all her fear and doubt until nothing remained but the fire. She played for 3 hours that night, running through the piece again and again until her arms ached and her fingers were sore. Emmanuel sat in the corner and listened, occasionally stopping her to correct a passage or suggest a different approach to a particularly difficult section. When she finally finished, she asked him honestly if he thought she was ready to perform Islami in front of hundreds of people. He was quiet for a long moment, and Alina's heart nearly stopped as she waited for his answer. Then he smiled and told her that he had heard great pianists perform this piece on the stages of the finest concert halls in the world, and he told her that none of them had played it with as much heart and fire and raw emotion as she did. He said that technique was important, but what mattered most was the soul behind the music, and Alina's soul was extraordinary. She left Whitmore that night feeling like she could fly if she spread her arms and jumped. The fear was still there, hiding in the corners of her mind, but it was no longer in control. She had made her decision, and nothing would change it now. In 6 days, she would walk onto the stage of the winter showcase and do something that nobody expected. She would defy Madame Forsyth and all the teachers who had underestimated her. She would prove wrong Every student who had laughed at her, and every voice that had told her to know her place, she would play the music that had been burning inside her for years, and she would play it so loudly and so brilliantly that no one would ever be able to ignore her again. Her parents did not know what was coming, and Alina hated keeping secrets from them, but she knew that if she told them, they would worry and try to protect her from the consequences of a rebellion. They had sacrificed so much to give her this opportunity, and they would not understand why she was willing to risk everything for one performance. Lena understood something that they did not, something that Emmanuel had helped her see. She understood that playing it safe was the biggest risk of all, because a life spent hiding your true self was no life at all. Better to burn brightly for one moment than to flicker dimly forever. Better to fail while reaching for greatness than to succeed at being small. The quiet rebellion had begun, and in 6 days, it would become a revolution that nobody would ever forget. Lena looked at her hands in the dim light of her bedroom and imagined them flying across the keys of the grand piano on the showcase stage. She could already hear the music in her head, and she could already feel the power flowing through her body like electricity. She was ready. She had been ready her whole life, and now, finally, the world was about to find out what Alina Vasquez could really do. The night before the winter showcase, Alina could not eat her dinner no matter how many times her mother told her she needed strength for the big day. Her stomach was tied in knots so tight that even the smell of her favorite rice and chicken made her feel like she might be sick. Her father noticed her pushing the food around her plate and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. He told her that he remembered feeling the same way before important moments in his own life, and that nerves were just the body's way of preparing for something that mattered. Elena smiled at him and nodded, but she could not tell him that her nerves came from something far bigger than just performing in front of a crowd. She was about to do something that could destroy everything her parents had worked for, and the weight of that secret was crushing her from the inside. After dinner, she helped her mother wash the dishes and then said she was going to bed early to get enough rest before the showcase. Her mother kissed her forehead and told her how proud she was of her daughter. No matter what happened tomorrow, Lena felt tears burning behind her eyes as she walked to her room, because she knew that tomorrow her mother might not feel so proud. She might feel ashamed and angry and heartbroken when she saw her daughter defy the teachers and break all the rules. But Alina could not turn back now, not after everything she had been through, not after all the secret hours of practice and all the dreams she had built in that basement room. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of her family settling in for the night. Her brothers were arguing about something in their room, and her father was watching a soccer game on the small television in the living room. These sounds that she had heard every night of her life suddenly seemed precious and fragile, like they might disappear forever after tomorrow. Waited until the apartment was completely quiet before she slipped out of bed and put on her shoes. She had become an expert at sneaking out without making a sound, knowing exactly which floorboards creaked and which doors squeaked. She made her way through the dark apartment and down the stairs, past the rumbling washing machines of the laundromat, and out into the cold December night. The subway was nearly empty at this hour, just a few tired workers heading home from late shifts and a homeless man sleeping across 3 seats. Alina sat by the window and watched the dark tunnels flash by, thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. She thought about the cardboard keyboard and Father Domingo church piano, and the first time she had heard music coming from that shop on the corner of her street. She thought about Margaret Wells, and the audition that had seemed like a miracle, and the cruel reality of what Whitmore had turned out to be. She thought about Emmanuel and all the hours they had spent together in that basement room, building something beautiful out of nothing but determination and love. By the time she reached Whitmore, she had made peace with whatever was going to happen tomorrow. She had done everything she could to prepare, and now all that remained was to walk onto that stage and let the music speak for itself. Emmanuel was waiting at the side door with 2 cups of hot chocolate he had made in the staff kitchen. He handed one to Alina and they walked together to the basement practice room. For the last time, neither of them spoke for a long while, just sitting in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing words. Finally, Emmanuel asked Alina if she wanted to run through Islami one more time, and she shook her head. She told him that she had practiced enough, and that playing it again tonight might actually make her worse instead of better. Emmanuel nodded with approval, because he knew that over-practicing before a big performance could drain the freshness and spontaneity from the music. Instead, they talked about other things, about Emmanuel's childhood in Nigeria, and his dreams of becoming a concert pianist, and the day the doctor told him about his arthritis. He told Alina stories she had never heard before, about his mother who had sold vegetables in the market to pay for his first piano lessons. He told her about his teacher in Lagos, an old German man who had fled Europe after the war and found his way to Africa. He told her about the competitions he had won and the concerts he had played and the standing ovations that had once made him feel like the luckiest man in the world. And then he told her about the day he realized his hands would never work the same way again, and how he had wanted to die because music was the only thing that gave his life meaning. Alina listened with tears running down her face, because she understood now that Emmanuel had given her more than just piano lessons. He had given her his dream, the dream that had been stolen from him, and he was trusting her to carry it forward into the world. She promised him again that she would not let him down, and he smiled and told her that she had already made him prouder than he had ever been in his entire life. They sat together until the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Emmanuel told Alina she should go home and get a few hours of sleep before the showcase, and he walked her to the door before she left. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He pressed it into her hands and told her not to open it until she was sitting at the piano on the stage. Alina tried to ask what it was, but Emmanuel just shook his head and told her she would understand when the time came. She hugged him tightly and felt his thin arms wrap around her like the wings of a guardian angel. Then she walked out into the cold morning air and made her way home, the mysterious object tucked safely in her pocket. She climbed back into her bed just as the sun was rising over Queens, and she fell into a deep sleep filled with dreams of music and fire. When her mother woke her up a few hours later, Alina felt surprisingly calm and clear-headed. Fear and doubt that had plagued her for weeks had burned away during the night, leaving only a quiet certainty about what she needed to do. She took a shower and put on the dress her mother had altered for her, the same second-hand dress she had worn to every performance at Whitmore. Her mother fussed with her hair and her father took pictures with the old camera he had bought at a pawn shop years ago. Her little brothers told her she looked like a princess, and Alina laughed and hugged them both at the same time. The whole family rode the subway together to Whitmore, and Alina sat between her parents with their hands clasped in hers. She wanted to tell them what she was about to do, to prepare them for what was coming, but the words would not come out. Instead, she just held their hands and tried to memorize the feeling of this moment, when they still believed everything was going to be okay. When they arrived at Whitmore, the auditorium was already filling with people in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry. Lena saw scouts from Juilliard and Curtis and other famous music schools sitting in the front rows with notebooks and serious expressions. Saw critics from the New York Times and other newspapers settling into their seats, ready to judge the young performers with their sharp and unforgiving pens. And she saw Madame Forsyth standing near the stage in a long black dress, greeting donors and parents with her cold and perfect smile. Elena's parents found seats in the back of the auditorium because the better seats were reserved for wealthy families and important guests. Her father was wearing his best jacket, the one he only wore to church on special Sundays, and her mother had put on lipstick for the first time in months. They looked so proud and hopeful sitting there in the back row, and Alina felt her heart squeeze with love and guilt. She went backstage to wait with the other performers, and none of them spoke to her or even looked in her direction. That was fine with Alina, because she did not want to talk to any of them anyway. She found a quiet corner and sat down with her eyes closed, running through Islami in her mind note by note. She could feel the music living inside her body, coiled like a spring waiting to be released in her pocket. She could feel the weight of Emmanuel's mysterious gift, and she wondered what could be inside that small cloth bundle. Soon she would find out, and soon the whole world would find out what Alina Vasquez was really made of. The waiting was almost over, and the fire was ready to burn. The showcase began at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, and the auditorium was packed with more than 500 people. Lena watched from the wings as the first student walked onto the stage, a boy named William whose father owned half the office buildings in Manhattan. He played a Mozart sonata with perfect technique but no soul, his fingers hitting all the right notes without ever making the music come alive. The audience applauded politely when he finished, and the scouts in the front row made notes on their clipboards without showing any real excitement. One by one, the students took their turns on the grand piano that sat in the center of the stage. Like a sleeping dragon, some played well and some played poorly, but none of them played in a way that made Elena's heart beat faster or her breath catch in her throat. She kept waiting for someone to surprise her, to show her that she was not the only one who understood what music was really supposed to feel like. But as each performer finished and walked off the stage, Alina realized that she was alone in her understanding. These students had been given every advantage in life, the best teachers and the finest instruments, and all the money they could ever need, but they did not have the hunger that came from wanting something so badly you would draw a piano on cardboard just to feel closer to your dream. They did not have the fire that came from being told over and over again that you were not good enough, that you should know your place, that you were meant to play small. Jonathan Whitmore III played his Rachmaninoff concerto with impressive speed but cold precision, like a machine programmed to hit keys rather than a human being expressing emotion. Chen performed her list with flashy technique that impressed the audience but left Alina feeling empty and unmoved. The hours passed slowly backstage as Alina waited for her turn, which was near the end of the program. She spent most of the time alone in her corner, breathing deeply and keeping her mind focused on the music she was about to play. Some of the other students whispered and pointed in her direction, probably wondering why the scholarship girl looked so calm when she was about to embarrass herself with her simple little piece. Let them wonder, Alina thought, and let them watch. Her name was finally called at 9:30 in the evening. Second to last on the program, she stood up and smoothed the skirt of her second-hand dress, feeling the familiar fabric under her fingers like an old friend in her pocket. Emmanuel's gift pressed against her leg, reminding her that she was not alone. Even though he was not here tonight, she had wanted to invite him to the showcase, but he had refused. saying that janitors did not belong in audiences full of rich people. Instead, he had told her he would be watching in his own way, and that his heart would be with her every moment she was on that stage. Alina walked toward the entrance to the stage, and the stage manager looked at her with the same dismissive expression everyone at Whitmore had given her for the past 2 years. He told her she was up next, and gestured for her to wait by the curtain until the current performer finished. Alina stood there in the darkness, listening to the polite applause as another forgettable performance came to an end. The announcer's voice echoed through the auditorium, reading her name and her assigned piece from the program. Elena Busquets, performing Gymnopédie No. 1 by Erik Satie. She heard a few snickers from the audience, probably from students and parents who knew how simple that piece was compared to what the other performers had played. She also heard her mother's voice calling out encouragement from the back of the auditorium, and she felt her heart swell with love. The stage lights were blinding as Lena stepped out from behind the curtain and began the long walk to the piano. The grand piano looked enormous from this angle, its black surface gleaming under the bright lights like the shell of some ancient beast. Lena had played this piano many times during rehearsals, but it looked different now. Surrounded by hundreds of watching eyes and waiting ears, she could see Madame Forsyth in the front row, her silver hair pulled back tight and her thin lips curved in a small, satisfied smile. The teacher was expecting her charity case student to play her quiet little piece and fade into the background where she belonged. Lena felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down and let it transform into something more useful. Anger was energy, and energy was exactly what she needed for what she was about to do. She reached the piano and stood beside the bench for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Her eyes found her parents in the back row, her father in his church jacket and her mother in her lipstick, both of them beaming with pride. She wished she could tell them that everything was going to be okay, but she did not know if that was true. All she knew was that she could not play small anymore, not for another minute, not for another note. She sat down on the bench and adjusted its height, taking her time to make sure everything was perfect. Then she remembered Emmanuel's gift and reached into her pocket to pull out the small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it carefully in her lap where the audience could not see what she was doing. Inside the cloth was a small wooden figurine of a bird with its wings spread wide, carved with incredible detail despite its tiny size. On the bottom of the figurine, Emmanuel had written 3 words in his careful handwriting: "Now fly." Alina, tears blurred her vision for just a moment before she blinked them away and placed the little bird on top of the piano where she could see it. The audience was getting restless, wondering why this girl was taking so long to play her simple 3-minute piece. Madame Forsyth's smile had faded into a frown, and she looked like she was about to stand up and tell Alina to get on with it. Alina placed her hands on the keys and felt the cool ivory under her fingertips. She took one deep breath and let it out slowly, emptying her mind of everything except the music that lived inside her. The audience leaned forward in their seats, expecting the soft opening notes of Satie's gentle masterpiece, but the notes that exploded from the piano were not soft, and they were not gentle. They were the thundering opening chords of a slip, crashing through the auditorium like a wave breaking against rocks. Alina heard gasps ripple through the audience, and she saw Madame Forsyth's face go white with shock. But Alina was no longer looking at her teacher or at the audience, or at anything in the physical world. She was inside the music now, flying on wings of fire and fury, and everything she had held inside her for 14 years. Her fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that should have been impossible for someone her age and size. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam, unstoppable and overwhelming and beautiful beyond words. She played the wild folk melodies that Balakirev had woven into his masterpiece, the songs of the Caucasus Mountains that had inspired the composer more than 100 years ago. We played the impossible runs that went from the lowest notes to the highest notes in the blink of an eye, played the crashing chords that sounded like thunder rolling across the sky, and the delicate passages that sounded like raindrops falling on leaves. The audience sat, frozen in their seats, unable to move or breathe or do anything except watch this small girl create something they had never seen before. The scouts from Juilliard and Curtis stopped taking notes because their hands were shaking too much to write. The critics from the newspapers forgot about their clever phrases and harsh judgments because they were too busy trying to understand what they were witnessing. And in the front row, Madame Forsyth sat with her mouth hanging open and her hands gripping the armrests of her chair like she was afraid she might. Felina played on, oblivious to everything except the music and the little wooden bird sitting on top of the piano. She was flying now, just like Emmanuel had told her to, and nothing in the world could bring her back down to earth. The fire inside her chest had finally been set free, and it was burning so bright that everyone in that auditorium could feel its heat. This was who she really was, who she had always been, and she would never hide it again. Elena's hands were moving so fast they looked like they belonged to someone else, someone with supernatural powers that defied the laws of physics. The music coming from the piano was not just sound anymore. It was a living thing that filled every corner of the auditorium and wrapped around every person in the audience. People who had been checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors who were now sitting completely still, hypnotized by what they were hearing, and seeing a woman in the third row was crying without knowing why. and a man near the back had stood up from his seat just to get a better view of this impossible performance. Lena did not see any of this because her eyes were half closed and her mind was somewhere far beyond that auditorium. She was in a place where there was no Madame Forsyth and no snobbish students and no cramped apartment above a laundromat. She was in a place made entirely of music, where the only thing that mattered was the next note and the next phrase and the next explosion of sound. The middle section of Islami was the most technically demanding part of the entire piece, filled with passages that required the hands to cross over each other at impossible speed. Lena had practiced this section thousands of times in Emmanuel's basement room, and her fingers knew exactly where to go without her brain needing to tell them. She attacked the keys with a ferocity that made several people in the audience gasp out loud. Her small hands stretched across octaves they should not have been able to reach, powered by years of practice and a determination that refused to accept any limitations. The sweat was beginning to form on her forehead now, and her arms were starting to feel the strain of the relentless physical demands, but she did not slow down or hold back, because she knew that this was her one chance to show the world who she really was. If she failed now, everything she had worked for would be lost, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. So she pushed through the exhaustion and the pain, letting the music carry her forward like a river carrying a leaf. The audience had never heard anything like this from a student at the Winter Showcase, and most of them had never heard anything like this in their entire lives. This was not just technical brilliance. Although the technique was extraordinary, this was something deeper and more powerful, something that came from the soul rather than just the fingers. Elena was telling a story with every note. The story of a girl who had been told she was not good enough, who had been given a cardboard keyboard instead of a real piano. She was telling the story of a father who drove a taxi until 2 in the morning and a mother who scrubbed other people's floors. She was telling the story of a janitor with broken hands who had given her everything he had left her. Give all of that pain and love and struggle and hope was pouring out through her fingers and into the piano and out into the world. In the back row, Elena's parents sat holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Miria Vasquez had tears streaming down her face, and she did not bother to wipe them away because she could not take her eyes off her daughter. She had never heard Elena play like this before, had never even known that her daughter was capable of such things. All those nights when Elena said she was going to bed early, all those mornings when she looked exhausted even though she claimed to have slept well. Now, Maria understood what her daughter had really been doing, and she felt a mixture of pride and fear that was almost too much to bear. Roberto Vasquez sat beside his wife with his mouth slightly open, watching his little girl transform into someone he barely recognized. He thought about all the extra shifts he had driven, all the sleep he had sacrificed, all the dreams he had set aside so that Elena could have this chance, and he realized in that moment that every single sacrifice had been worth it, because his daughter was not just playing piano, she was making history right before his eyes, and nobody in this auditorium would ever forget what they were witnessing in the front row. Madame Forsyth had not moved a muscle since the first shocking notes of Islami had exploded from the piano. Her face had gone through several colors in the past few minutes, from white to red to something that looked almost gray. She was watching her most dismissed student, the charity case she had tried to keep small and quiet, deliver a performance that made every other student look like a beginner. Her hands were trembling in her lap, and she did not know if it was from anger or shock or something else entirely. She thought about all the times she had told Elena to know her place, to accept her limitations, to play small. She thought about the simple piece she had assigned for the showcase, the gentle sati that would have let Elena fade into the background, and she realized that she had been completely and utterly wrong about this girl. From the very beginning, Lena was approaching the climax of Islami now, the section where all the themes came together in a final explosion of sound and fury. Fingers were flying across the keys so fast they were almost a blur, and the piano was practically roaring under her assault. The audience was on the edge of their seats, barely breathing, afraid to make any sound that might break the spell. Some of them had never heard this piece before and did not know how it ended, but all of them could feel that something massive was about to happen. Lena built the tension higher and higher, layering chord upon chord and phrase upon phrase until the music seemed ready to burst, and then, with one final cascade of notes that seemed to pour down from the heavens like a waterfall of pure sound, she brought the piece to its thundering conclusion. The last chord rang out through the auditorium and hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Lena's hands remained on the keys, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. Her chest was heaving as she tried to catch her breath, and she could feel her heart pounding so hard it seemed like it might break through her ribs. For a long, terrible moment, there was absolute silence in the auditorium. Elena sat at the piano with her eyes still closed, afraid to look out at the audience, afraid to see their reaction. What if they were angry that she had defied the program and played a different piece? What if they thought her performance was not good enough, that she had been foolish to attempt something so far beyond her assigned place? What if Madame Forsyth was already walking toward the stage to drag her off and expel her from Whitmore forever? The silence stretched on, and Elena felt her heart sinking with every second that passed, and then, like the first crack of thunder after a long drought, a single person started clapping. It was a man in the front row, one of the scouts from Juilliard, and he was rising to his feet as he applauded. Another person joined him, and then another, and then suddenly the entire auditorium was erupting in the loudest and longest standing ovation anyone could remember. The sound was deafening, hundreds of people cheering and clapping and shouting their approval. Lena finally opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of faces, all of them on their feet, all of them looking at her like she had just performed a miracle. She saw her parents in the back row, standing and clapping and crying and laughing all at the same time. She saw the scouts from the famous music schools leaning forward with excitement on their faces. She saw students who had mocked her and excluded her now applauding with tears in their eyes. She saw Madame Forsyth, still sitting in her front row seat, her face a mask of emotions that Alina could not read. Alina looked at the little wooden bird on top of the piano and smiled through her own tears. She had flown, just like Emmanuel had told her to, and she had landed somewhere wonderful. The standing ovation went on for nearly 5 minutes, and Alina did not know what to do except stand beside the piano and bow again and again. She had never experienced anything like this in her life. This wave of love and admiration crashing over her from hundreds of strangers. Her legs felt weak and her hands were still shaking from the intensity of the performance, but she forced herself to stand tall and accept the applause with grace. When the clapping finally began to die down and people started returning to their seats, Alina walked off the stage on legs that felt like they were made of rubber. She had barely made it behind the curtain when she was surrounded by people wanting to talk to her, to congratulate her, to ask her questions. The scout from Juilliard reached her first, a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes who introduced himself as Dr. Richard Hammond. He told Alina that he had been coming to the Whitmore Showcase for 15 years and had never seen anything like what she had just done. He asked her where she had studied and who had taught her to play like that, and Alina told him about Emmanuel without giving his name. She said only that she had been taught by a great pianist who could no longer perform himself, and that she owed everything to his patience and belief in her. Dr. Hammond pulled out his card and pressed it into Alina's hand, telling her that Juilliard would be honored to have her audition for their program. He said that if her audition was anywhere close to what she had just performed, a full scholarship would almost certainly be waiting for her. Alina thanked him with tears in her eyes because she knew that a scholarship to Juilliard could change her entire life and the lives of her family. Other scouts pushed forward to speak with her, representatives from Curtis and the New England Conservatory and other famous schools. They all said similar things, that they had never seen such raw talent combined with such emotional depth, that Alina was clearly destined for greatness. A critic from the New York Times asked if he could interview her for an article he was writing about the showcase. He said he wanted to tell the story of the girl who had defied expectations and stunned everyone with a performance that would be talked about for years. Alina was overwhelmed by all the attention, and she kept looking around for her parents, needing their familiar faces to anchor her in this strange new reality. She finally spotted them pushing through the crowd, her mother's face streaked with tears and her father looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. When they reached her, Maria Vasquez grabbed her daughter and hugged her so tightly that Alina could barely breathe. Her mother was sobbing against her shoulder, saying that she was so proud, so incredibly proud of her baby girl. Roberto Vasquez stood beside them with his hand on Elena's back, and when she looked up at his face, she saw that he was crying too. Her father never cried, not even when he had lost his job for 3 months and they had almost been evicted from their apartment, but he was crying now, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks as he looked at his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the entire world. He told her that she had made him prouder than any father had ever been, and that every sacrifice had been worth it for this moment. Hugged both her parents at the same time, and for a few precious seconds, the chaos around them faded away. It was just the three of them, a taxi driver and a house cleaner and their daughter who had just changed everything. But the moment could not last forever because there were still people waiting to speak with Alina and congratulate her. The crowd parted suddenly, and Alina looked up to see Madame Forsyth walking toward her with a strange expression on her face. The silver-haired teacher moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through water, and everyone stepped aside to let her pass. Alina felt her mother's grip tighten on her arm, and she knew that her parents were expecting something bad to happen. They knew that Alina had defied her teacher by playing a different piece, and they were afraid of the consequences. Madame Forsyth stopped in front of Alina and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Her face was impossible to read, a mixture of emotions that seemed to be fighting for control. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Alina had ever heard it. Barely more than a whisper, she said that in her entire career, she had never been more wrong about a student than she had been about Alana. She said that she had let her own prejudices blind her to the extraordinary talent that had been right in front of her all along. She apologized for the simple pieces and the dismissive comments and the years of holding Alina back from her true potential. Did not know what to say because she had imagined this confrontation many times, but she had never imagined it would go like this. She had expected anger and punishment, maybe expulsion from Whitmore and the end of her dreams. Instead, she was receiving an apology from the proudest and coldest teacher she had ever known. Madame Forsyth told Alina that the performance she had just given was worthy of the greatest concert halls in the world. She said that she would personally write letters of recommendation to every music school that wanted Alania, and then she did something that shocked Alina more than anything else that happened that night. She reached out and took both of Elena's hands in her own, and she bowed her head slightly in what looked almost like respect. She told Alina to never let anyone make her play small again, not even teachers who should have known better. Then she turned and walked away through the crowd, leaving Alina standing there with her mouth open and her mind spinning. Our parents looked at each other with confusion and relief, not quite believing what they had just witnessed. The crowd around them began buzzing with excitement because everyone had seen Madame Forsyth bow to her charity case students. The story would spread quickly through the world of classical music, the story of the girl from Queens who had shocked everyone at the Winter Showcase. But Alina was not thinking about stories or fame or any of that in this moment. She was thinking about Emmanuel, alone in his small apartment somewhere in the city, waiting to hear how the night had gone. She needed to find a phone and call him, to tell him that she had flown just like he told her to. She needed to tell him that his gift had given her courage when she needed it most, and that she had made him proud. She needed to thank him for believing in her when nobody else did, for seeing the fire inside her and helping it grow, because without Emmanuel there would have been no performance tonight, no standing ovation, no scouts pressing business cards into her hands. There would have been only a quiet girl, playing a quiet piece and fading into the background, like Madame Forsyth had always wanted. Lena excused herself from the crowd, and I found a quiet corner backstage where she could use her phone. She dialed the number that Emmanuel had given her for emergencies, her hand still trembling as she pressed the buttons. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, and his voice sounded tired but happy on the other end. Before he could say anything, Elena told him that she had done it, that she had played Islami and brought the house down. She told him about the standing ovation and the scouts and Madame Forsyth's apology, and then she told him the most important, the thing of all. She told him that this victory belonged to both of them, and that she would spend the rest of her life making sure the world knew his name. Emmanuel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. He told Alina that this was her victory and hers alone, that she had earned every moment of tonight with her own hard work and courage. But he also told her that she had given an old man something he thought he had lost forever. She had given him hope that dreams could still come true, even when the world tried to crush them. Elena stood in that quiet corner backstage and cried happy tears while the celebration continued around her. Tomorrow there would be interviews and decisions and the beginning of a new chapter in her life, but tonight she just wanted to share this moment with the people who mattered most: her parents who had sacrificed everything, and her secret teacher who had given her wings to fly. 10 years had passed since that unforgettable night at the Whitmore Winter Showcase, and Alina Vasquez had become one of the most celebrated pianists of her generation. She had graduated from Juilliard with the highest honors any student had ever received, and she had won international competitions that had made her name known in concert halls around the world. She had played for presidents and queens, for sold-out audiences in Vienna and Paris and Tokyo, and for millions of people who watched her performances on television and the internet. But no matter how famous she became or how many awards she won, Alina never forgot where she had come from or the people who had helped her along the way. Her parents had moved out of the apartment above the laundromat years ago, into a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood that Roberto had paid for with the money Alina sent home every month. They came to every performance they could, sitting in the best seats instead of the back row, wearing clothes that fit properly instead of thrift store alterations. Maria Vasquez had stopped cleaning other people's houses, and Roberto had hung up his taxi keys for the last time. They spent their days gardening and cooking, and telling anyone who would listen about their daughter. The famous pianist Father Domingo's little church had become a tourist attraction of sorts, with people coming from all over to see the piano where Elena Vasquez had first learned to play. The priest had put up a small plaque on the wall that told the story of the girl who used to practice there every day after school, and the cardboard keyboard that Elena had made when she was 8 years old was now displayed in a glass case at the Whitmore Conservatory, a reminder that talent could come from the most unexpected places. But the person Alina thought about most often was Emmanuel, who had passed away peacefully in his sleep just 3 years after that fateful showcase. She had been touring in Europe when she got the news, and she had cancelled her next 5 performances so she could fly back to New York for his funeral. The service was held in a small church not far from Whitmore, and Alina had played Islami one more time, tears streaming down her face as she poured all her love and gratitude into every note. She had paid for his headstone with her own money, and she had chosen the words that were carved into the granite. They said simply, Emmanuel, teacher, dreamer, friend, and underneath that, he gave others wings to fly. Every year on the anniversary of his death, Alina visited his grave and left flowers and the little wooden bird he had given her that night. She would sit on the grass beside his headstone and talk to him about her life, about her performances and her struggles and her dreams for the future. She told him about the music school she had founded in Queens for children who could not afford lessons, a school that bore his name and carried on his legacy, the Emmanuel Okonkwo School of Music. had already produced dozens of talented young musicians, kids from poor families who might otherwise have never touched a piano or a violin. Alina herself taught there whenever she was home between tours, sitting with students who reminded her of herself at that age, hungry and determined and full of fire. She told Emmanuel about all of this during her visits to his grave, and she liked to imagine that he could hear her sigh. She liked to think that he was proud of what she had done with the gift he had given her, and that his dream was finally coming true. Through her, the journalists who interviewed Alina always asked about her remarkable rise from poverty to international stardom. They wanted to know the secret of her success, the thing that set her apart from all the other talented pianists in the world. And Alina always told them the same thing, a message she hoped would reach anyone who had ever been told they were not good enough. She told them about the teachers and classmates who had underestimated her, about Madame Forsyth and her cold dismissals. She told them about the night she had decided to defy everyone's expectations and play the music she was meant to play, and she always ended with the same words she had first spoken in an interview shortly after the showcase and had repeated hundreds of times since: "They will tell you to be quiet," she would say, her dark eyes burning with the same fire that had never gone out since she was a little girl. "They will tell you to know your place and accept your limitations and play small, but you must not listen to them, because they are afraid of what you might become if you ever stop playing by their rules. Play loud instead. Play so loud that they have no choice but to listen, and never stop until the whole world can hear your voice." Those words had been printed on posters and shared on social media and quoted in graduation speeches at schools around the world. It had inspired countless young people to pursue their dreams, despite the obstacles in their way. But to Alina, they were not just inspirational words meant to sound good in interviews. They were the truth she had learned through years of struggle and sacrifice. The lesson that Emmanuel had taught her in that basement practice room. The world was full of people who would try to make you small, who would tell you that your dreams were too big for someone like you, but the only person who could really decide how big you could be was yourself. Alina understood now that her rebellion at the Winter Showcase had not just been about proving Madame Forsyth wrong. It had been about claiming her own voice and refusing to let anyone else define who she was or what she could become. That was a real gift that Emmanuel had given her, not just the piano lessons and the technical training. He had given her permission to believe in herself, to trust the fire that burned inside her chest, and that fire had carried her further than she ever could have imagined. From a cardboard keyboard in a cramped apartment to the greatest stages in the world, Lene was performing at Carnegie Hall tonight, the most famous concert venue in America and perhaps the entire world. It was the same hall where the greatest musicians in history had played, and Alina had dreamed of standing on this stage since she was a little girl, listening to recordings at the public library. Her parents were in the front row, of course, Maria in a beautiful dress and Roberto in a real suit, both of them gray-haired now, but still beaming with the same pride they had shown at every performance. Since that first showcase, the auditorium was packed with 3,000 people who had paid hundreds of dollars to hear Elena Vasquez play. That had come from all over the world, fans who had followed her career for years and new listeners who wanted to experience the phenomenon. They had heard so much about Lina stood in the wings, waiting for her cue to walk onto the stage, and she felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. No matter how many times she performed, she always felt this way before stepping into the spotlight, but it was a good kind of nervousness, the kind that reminded her she was alive, and that what she was about to do mattered. She reached into her pocket and felt the little wooden bird that Emmanuel had carved for her all those years ago. She carried it with her to every performance, a reminder of where she had started and who had believed in her first. The stage manager gave her the signal, and Alina walked out into the blazing lights of Carnegie Hall. The applause that greeted her was like a wave of warmth and love, 3,000 people welcoming her to the stage. She walked to the grand piano and sat down on the bench, adjusting it to the perfect height as she had done thousands of times before. She looked out at the sea of faces, all those people who had come to hear her play, and she felt a surge of gratitude that made her eyes sting with tears. Then she placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music filled Carnegie Hall like a flood of light, and Alina felt herself lifting off the ground once again. She was flying, just like Emmanuel had always told her she couldn't. Somewhere, she knew he was listening and smiling and proud of the girl who had refused to play Smalda, girl who had become a voice that could never be silenced.